A woman pleading guilty for tampering with human remains in the case of a young man missing and then found dead in the Greenbelt. Still, Austin police say their investigation is not over. This is Unsolved. Nearly everyone remembers where they were on April 8, 2024, as a historic total solar eclipse rolled over Austin's skies. But that was also the last day anyone saw Christian Rangel. The 24-year-old's body was found in the Greenbelt 11 days later. This week, a woman named Camry Wooldridge pleaded guilty to tampering with human remains in this case. But Austin police say their investigation into the circumstances surrounding Rangel's death is still open and active. Joining me now to break down the case is our public safety reporter, Brianna Hollis, who has covered this case extensively. Bree, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Okay, before we get into this, we want to note for our audience that Bree has a series called Crime Imprints, and that's where she takes more of a nuanced approach to covering crime, more community-centered. You're really going beyond the police tape and looking at the impact on people. So talk about why that approach is important to covering crime in our city.
So this gives us more time to explore these cases in so many ways. One, more time like literally on air for a story. They can air longer than a typical daily story, which is, just for reference, normally a minute to 2 minutes. Here, I kind of get that 3 to 6 minutes to really let a story breathe. And it also gives me more time behind the scenes to explore these topics and maybe tap into things that people might not think of as something that actually impacts people, whether that's situations where statutes of limitations are involved or, something. Of course, we're going to cover the homicides and the violent crime and getting into that, but there's a lot more to the criminal justice system that people don't see, and I want to make sure to give people those voices.
We know that also means you are often following these cases through to their resolution into court and as those court proceedings progress, and that'll be important later on for this case. But let's get to the case, and actually let's start with Christian. Who was he? You talked to his family, and how do they remember him?
So the first thing that his mom told me about him, that's always the first question I like to ask, by the way, when I'm talking to a family. Obviously we're usually addressing something pretty heavy, but I really like to start with who, in this case, who was your son? What do you miss the most about him? Let's just kind of ground ourselves in the fact that this is a person, right? And the first thing she said was that he was always just a really happy kid. She also did mention that he had gone through some struggles and, there was a little bit of drug addiction at some point, but she said that through that really made him an empathetic person, and that's something she really admired about him.
So take us back to April of last year. What do we know about April 8th?
So April 8th, the day of the eclipse, it was kind of a situation where everyone knew where they were that day, and that's gonna come into play later. We'll bring that up. But Christian was last seen at a Walmart on that day, and then his body was found 11 days later nearby at alongside Barton Creek.
We know that police were originally investigating this as a death investigation. They later began a homicide investigation. So explain what we know from police about how that transpired.
Yeah, so he was found, or last seen on April 8th, and body found 11 days later. So it took a little bit of time to actually gather that forensic evidence, if you can imagine. So sometime in July, police ended up determining that there was physical evidence that some kind of attack had occurred.
Around that same time is when police were also releasing some video evidence, which we'll put up here on the screen. But some of the video evidence actually from that Walmart store started to help them piece together some clues about what might have happened that day.
Yes, so that video shows Christian Rangel getting into a car in the parking lot. It also later shows that car speeding off, and police say there was a point where it looked like he was trying to get out of the car. Police ultimately determined that that vehicle belonged to the defendant, in this case, Camry Wooldridge, and they also had determined that Wooldridge had disposed of the body near the creek, but that was it. That was kind of the extent of the evidence they had. There was nothing else particularly piecing anything together about an actual attack or anything.
So enough evidence to charge her with tampering with a body.
Exactly.
But not to make that leap to a murder charge.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So we know when you spoke to family, they were urging people to come forward. Family and also detectives in this case, at one point, family offering a $9,000 reward on top of the existing Crime Stoppers reward. I mean, they just seemed desperate for more information to try to piece together what occurred. What was that like when you spoke to them at that time?
They really just wanted to see murder charges. The family did. They, you know, and just, I can't even imagine being in that situation. You know, you have a good amount of evidence, but you're just missing this one piece that can give you an idea of what happened. And we already brought up the fact that this happened the day of that historic eclipse last year, but that's something that Rangel's mom just kept telling me. She said, everyone knows where they were that day. You know, if you were at Walmart that day, you had to have seen something. You know, sometimes if you just named like an arbitrary date, like what were you doing on September 2nd? You know, I'd be like, I don't know. But if you're like, oh, what were you doing the day of the eclipse? You can kind of piece that together. So she was really hoping for that. Police never outright said, you know, hey, we are looking for evidence to, you know, pin a murder on this person, but they did consistently say that they are searching for more evidence to piece more things together, and if the evidence did support it, that there was obviously a chance that they could upgrade that to a murder charge.
Talk a little bit about the reward money in this situation. Family, you know, doing what they can. There was an existing $1,000 reward through Crime Stoppers. I know in your reporting, you actually learned a bit more about what that system looks like, how it works.
Yeah, this is actually the first time I really got an idea about how this worked. I mean, of course, you know, in every police department press conference, they're always saying, you know, submit tips to Crime Stoppers. You can be anonymous. But this was the first time I really dove into it. So it was really interesting to learn a little bit more about how that worked. So it kind of starts with the Austin Police Department, even though Crime Stoppers runs that side of it. If APD determines a certain tip actually did help, you know, lead to an arrest or whatever exactly they're looking for, they will then go and submit that information to Crime Stoppers. But from there, it's all in Crime Stoppers' hands. So police don't end up actually getting to know, you know, which tips actually got money and whatnot. And part of that is just because the, you know, privacy and anonymity nature of it.
Trying to probably keep the integrity of the system working too. Very interesting. Okay, we also know, speaking of police, you sat down with the lead detective on this case. What stood out to you about that conversation?
So he made an analogy to a puzzle when it comes to homicide investigations. Don't have his exact quote in front of me, but it was something along the lines of, if you put a puzzle together and you're just missing a few pieces, you can tell if it's a house or you can tell if it's a horse. So, but you just need, you know, those final few pieces to actually finish the whole thing. And he also explained that, you know, at the beginning of a puzzle, you know, one piece may seem inconsequential. Sometimes a small piece of information someone might have may seem inconsequential, but putting that all together can really create a full picture. And that's why they were really pushing for those last few bits of information.
It's such a good reminder for people who, like you said, may remember where they were that day and think it doesn't matter where I was, but if you were anywhere in that area, it could be key to this case. Okay, we'll note for our audience, this week, Wooldridge appeared in court pleading guilty to those tampering with a body charges. A judge sentenced her to serve 10 years in prison with 153 days of jail time credited against that sentence for time already served. But still, Austin police say they are not finished investigating. They came out with a statement this week saying their investigation's open and active.
Yeah, they said they are still searching for more evidence that, you know, because we mentioned that back in July, there was evidence that an attack happened. So they are still going down that road, even though the plea has already happened. And they also did make a point that they really are committed to getting justice for this family.
We saw, our crew in the courtroom saw really some emotion from the family. Rangel's mother, who you've talked to in the past, was clearly emotional on the stand, facing the defendant who pled guilty to tampering charges. Anything else that stood out from your conversation earlier with the family? Anything that maybe we haven't talked about today as this case is still being investigated?
So a big thing that Rangel's mom was talking to me about was just wanting the closure and just, wanting to know what happened. And, while she's grateful for, some kind of outcome and some movement within the criminal justice system, she did say, quote, "I don't think there is ever going to be closure." And she says there's still questions. And she said, this ended in a plea of 10 years. And she said she can't put a number on her son's life, and she's grateful for the investigators, but she wishes she did have those last few pieces of the puzzle.
I do want to ask you, Bree, as someone who's covering these crimes day in and day out, what often stands out to you? Do you hear that sentiment from victims and families often, or what jumps out to you as you cover the people impacted by crimes like this?
I think a lot of it really depends, because sometimes when something happens, the closure really, really means a lot. It can be difficult and it's painful, of course, and there's still that opens new wounds as you have to keep going back to court and whatnot. And that's something that I have really explored through the Crime Imprint series as I'm following things kind of to the edge of the criminal justice system and to the edge of that process. And I think it's interesting seeing the differences. Like here, while there still are these outstanding questions that, even investigators say there are still outstanding questions, hearing her talk about really wanting that closure. And then there's other cases where someone gets put away for life, and that almost still isn't closure either. So I think a lot of times too, it's easy for us when something happens, when a crime happens, we talk to people kind of shortly after the incident. And I think one thing I just want to remind everyone is, while it may leave the public's eye in just a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months, I mean, people are dealing with the court system for years because, due process is very much a thing, and these investigations need to be thorough and the court process needs to be thorough. So I think I've gained an even larger amount of sensitivity to folks who, keep having to come back every couple of months or so and, continue to relive something for years.
Bree, thank you so much for the work you do covering these cases for us here at KXAN and for joining us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We'll tell everybody that you can actually go catch up on all of Bree's reporting. Her Crime Imprint series can be found on our website, KXAN.com. And you can join us next week on KXAN Plus for another episode of Unsolved Central Texas. New episodes air every Thursday at 1. And to watch any episode anytime, go to KXAN.com or look for the KXAN Plus Originals category on our streaming app. We'll see you next week.